So now that we have some movement with our basic character controller, let's go ahead and set up a first-person camera view. And again, ultimately the goal here is that we want to create something that we can move around with our mouse, something that will hide the cursor and lock it to our screen, but then also turn us so that we're moving always forward in the direction that our camera is facing as well. So I've gone ahead and created a new script here called first-person camera. I'm going to add that to our player game object now. And let's open it up. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and locate our camera. We're going to need to remember to make this a child of our game object. And actually, I'm going to do that now because this seems to be the thing that I always forget. I'm going to take this main camera. Let's set it up here so that it's now a child of our player. Because I want it to be a first-person camera, I don't really want it to give me this view. It wouldn't really make much sense. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this thing. And here we go. I'm going to drag this up a little bit more, right? So there we go, sort of from the perspective of where this thing's eyes might be, this player or this character. Great. Excellent. So now I'm going to go back and work on my script. So now that I know that that's in the right place, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a variable here that we can use to just refer to its transform. And we're going to call this one player camera. And we want to keep track of this because we want to make sure that we are setting rotation and that we're moving things around based on this thing's transform rotation and not from the perspective necessarily of the game object itself. So there's kind of a back and forth that's going to happen here. So we're going to set a couple of other things as well, just to keep things moving. I'm going to set a public variable here, which will allow us to control the sensitivity of our mouse. So I'll call this one mouse sensitivity. And let's go ahead and populate that with a couple of values. We can always change this in the inspector later. Okay, that's pretty good. Now, we also want to make sure that we can limit the vertical rotation and keep track of it as well. And so let's go ahead and create a couple of private variables. So private float. Let's call this one rotation V. So this will be our vertical rotation along the X rotation axis. Let's go ahead and also, we're going to create one that is a couple of variables that are actually public variables. So these will give us an option to tweak them out in the inspector. And these will be floats. And we'll use these as ways of establishing both minimum and maximum degree of rotation. We don't with our cameras want to just like be able to move like fully like 360 degrees. You know, in this simple example, it doesn't matter so much. But say, for example, we have a player with a body, and we don't want to necessarily be able to just sort of clip through our body and see the insides of our mesh and everything. We also don't necessarily want to just be able to like look freely. You know, typically we don't want to be able to look like freely, like orbiting 360 degrees. Even just without our thinking of our bodies in this space. So we're going to give it some limits. And so the limits here, just as a place of starting, we're just going to say that these are -45 and 45. Oops, I got a typo. And, you know, we'll decide later on, like maybe this is a good maximum, but maybe the minimum's not great. So last thing I think I'm going to do here, I think this might actually be it. So I want, yeah, I think this is good for right now. We have a way of seeing what our player camera is, locating its transform, a way of setting the mouse sensitivity. That's very important. We have a private variable to keep track of our rotation, sort of where we are. This is important because, you know, as we're moving around, we want to make sure that it just stays there and doesn't snap back and forth between 0 and whatever the desired rotation is. And then we have our minimum maximum values that we're setting for this rotation as well. So this is good. What I'd like to do just to start is go ahead and set it up so that our cursor is no longer visible when we start playing our game. And so we can do this by setting cursor visible equal to false. And we're also going to make things a little more friendly. So if we're making the cursor invisible, it's really difficult for us as players to really know where the limits of our playing scene is. So we tend to just sort of pull our mouse in and out of that viewing window, and we can lock this so that it's always within that viewing window until we press escape by setting the cursor lock state. And I'm going to set this to cursor lock mode. And there are a couple of them that we can use, but I'm going to use locked here. It's just going to keep it locked right in the center, and it's going to ensure that everything stays where it is. And so this is great. If we want out of this, if we want to make our cursor visible again, and we want to free the cursor from being in this locked state, then we just need to hit escape to do that. The other thing I'm going to do here is just future-proof it a little bit. I'm not going to get carried away with that. It's sort of a really common pitfall for people to kind of over-design or over-engineer this stuff for, potential, for all the potential amazing game design choices that we're going to make later. But one thing that I know that I tend to want is a way of interacting with things in the world. And that interaction is largely happening through rigid bodies. Again, we could set up these controllers that we have to work with rigid bodies. But in this case, we can also set those things to either turn on or off, or to set them as like child game objects that we can use to just kind of detect an area right in front of us. And so if this game object happens to have a rigid body, I just want to go ahead and set it so that it doesn't rotate. Again, we may need to change this. We may want to make it so that our rotation only happens on certain axes. We maybe want to do this out in the inspector so that we can have a little more control over it as well. But in general, if I wanted to do this, I could also just do something like this here and just say, if there is a rigid body connected to this, let's go ahead and set that freeze rotation to true. And that will do it on all of the axes here. So that's all that we need to do for start. All of our movement here, the movement of the camera, will all happen by manipulating the transforms of either our player or the camera, which we've made a child of the player. And so we won't need to do anything in fixed update. We're going to do all of this inside of update here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use my mouse X as a way of dictating the rotation of my game object. And so we want to do this by setting our transform. We're going to use the method rotate. So we're using a capital R here. And we're going to say on the x-axis, that's going to be 0. However, on the y-axis, which is the one that allows us to spin around, we're going to use input, get axis, and we're going to set that to mouse X. And we're going to multiply that by whatever the mouse sensitivity is, right? So we want to tweak that out in the inspector until we get something that feels right for our game. And more specifically, we want to make sure that that mouse sensitivity, since it's a vector 2, we're handling both axes, and maybe we want to deal with those in slightly different ways. It's set to the X field of our vector here. And then on the Z, we're going to set that as 0. So we're just going to rotate that transform. Now what we're going to do is we're going to deal with the rotation of the camera. And so we'll do this by taking our rotation V variable and then subtracting input.getAxis on the mouse Y. Again, multiplied by the mouse sensitivity on the y-axis. And then that's it. So we're just going to take whatever that rotation variable is and subtract this amount from it. Now, we're going to clamp this, right? So again, we wanted to create a minimum and maximum for this. And so we're going to say that our rotation V is equal to mathf.clamp. And all this is going to do for us is just going to take this variable and say it has to be somewhere between these two values. And so in this case, it'll be this. which is our value. And now let's give it our minimum. So that is minimum V and then maximum V like this. Great. And so now we know that it's never going to exceed these variables in either direction. Okay, last thing we're going to do is actually apply this rotation to our camera. And this is why we were trying to find the transform for our player camera. Well, we want to rotate our game object, our player game object, on this y-axis so that we're spinning around. We want to make sure that if we want to look up and down, that we're doing this in a way that's relative to the player camera. We don't want the player to tilt up and down. We just want its camera to do that. And so here we're going to say player camera, and we're going to set the local Euler angle. So we're going to set the degrees of rotation here to a new vector 3. So I'm going to say equals new vector 3. And we're just going to give it one argument here, which is rotation V. So this is the adjusted, the clamped rotation V. We're only interested in this one axis, and so we can set the other two back to 0. And this should be it. So we're going to save this now. We're going to head back to Unity. We're going to look for any errors that are happening. Seems pretty good. We'll go back to player. Now, the way that we've written this script, remember, we're looking for a reference to the transform of our, our player camera. And so we'll go ahead and take that here just like that. And let's press play and see what happens. Okay, so I can look around. Great. Let's see if I can move where I'm facing. Looks good. Now, it looks like I'm not rotating because you can see my little axes gizmos here. They're not rotating. But also take note that I am up here in my scene view looking at my global view. Also notice that like in my game view, I am locked to the center of the screen with my cursor, and that you can't see the cursor. So I don't have to worry about accidentally leaving the scene. Right? And I can jump, and it seems to be working great. So now all I have to do is go back and fix that little typo, and we are set.